I drained every dollar of my retirement to build a diner with my stepson, a boy I'd loved like my own blood since he was 12 years old. He forged my signature, sold the place for close to $1.5 million, and mailed me a check for $4,500 with a memo line that said, "Gratitude for your years of service," like I was some waitress who'd forgotten to clock out. Now he scrubs my flat-top grill in a bright yellow uniform shirt that says, "Flipped on Family," across the back, and every single receipt this diner prints has his felony case number stamped right under the tax ID. I am going to tell you exactly how I proved that he never owned a single tile of that griddle, and how I took every stolen cent back at a closing table while he watched $1 million lie unravel in about 60 seconds. My name is Irene. I'm 54 years old, and before I ever met my late husband Jack, I spent 11 years as a line cook in a 24-hour pancake house outside of Akron, Ohio. That's where I learned to tear down a commercial flat top in under 20 minutes, rebuild a solenoid valve on a dishwasher with nothing but a wrench and a prayer, and keep my mouth shut while listening to drunks confess their sins over a stack of silver dollar pancakes. Those skills, the griddle and the listening, became the bedrock of my entire life after Jack passed. Jack and I had 15 good years together. He had a son from his first marriage named Mark. I loved Mark like my own from the very beginning. I paid for his community college courses when his grades wobbled. I co-signed the loan for his first car, a used Honda Civic that he drove into a ditch 3 months later. And when Jack's lung cancer took him 3 years ago, Mark was the one who stood right next to me at the funeral, his hand on my shoulder, whispering that we were still a family and that he'd never let me go through anything alone. I believed him with my whole heart. Jack left me a modest house with a leaky garage, a pickup truck with a cracked exhaust manifold, and a metal lockbox full of keepsakes from our marriage. I tucked that box into the back of my closet and didn't open it for months. The real thing Jack left behind was an idea, a dream we chased together one long weekend in Georgia a year before he got sick. We'd driven 6 hours to look at a rusted-out diner car, a fully restored 1956 Mountain View model, number 14 off the assembly line, with pale green vinyl booths and chrome trim that shimmered even under a layer of dust. We'd stood in that empty lot, holding hands, and he'd said, "Someday, Irene, we are going to serve pancakes on this griddle, and nobody is going to be able to shut us up." He died before that someday could come. 6 months after the funeral, Mark showed up at my kitchen table with a business plan. He had found that same diner car, still for sale, still sitting in Georgia waiting for a second chance. He'd also found a location in a gentrifying warehouse district near downtown, a corner lot with heavy foot traffic and zero breakfast competition. All he needed was capital. He asked me to go in 50-50. I drained my entire $401k. Every single dollar I had saved over a lifetime. $123,412. We signed a notarized partnership agreement in the back office of a credit union, drawn up by a small business attorney Mark had found. I read every line 3 times. The document stated that we each owned 50% of the business, that no transfer or dissolution could occur without both signatures notarized together, and that in the event of a buyout, proceeds would be split exactly equally. I still remember the weight of the notary's stamp when she pressed it into the paper. It felt like a heartbeat. We named the place the Gridiron Diner, a nod to Jack's love of high school football and the 20-foot chrome griddle that ran down the service line. I worked that griddle myself for the first 18 months. I'd show up at 4 in the morning, fire the pilots, season the steel with a blend of flaxseed and canola oil until it gleamed like a mirror, and train every cook who walked through the door. Mark handled the front of house, the marketing, and the books. I trusted him with the numbers because he'd taken accounting classes in college, and I thought that meant he knew what he was doing. The money grew steady. By year 2 we were clearing $6,000 a week in profit, and by year 3 a regional restaurant group started making noises about acquiring us. That's when the rot began to spread from the inside out. The first offer came in at $800,000. I said no gently. The diner was profitable and I honestly loved the work, the sound of the ticket machine printing orders and the rhythm of the rush. Mark pushed hard. A second offer arrived 6 weeks later, $1.4 million all cash, from a group that wanted to absorb the brand and turn it into a mini chain across 3 states. I told Mark I was willing to entertain it, but we'd have to sit down with a lawyer and make sure the terms were fair for both of us. He smiled, said he'd handle the paperwork, and told me to take a week off, relax, he had it all under control. That was a Wednesday. I remember the exact date because I wrote it on the calendar in the kitchen, October the 12th. On Friday afternoon, I came home from the grocery store with 2 bags of oranges and a gallon of milk, and I found a certified flat envelope leaning against my screen door. The return address was a law firm I'd never heard of, something generic like Davis and Associates. Inside the envelope, I found a single sheet of paper labeled Notice of Dissolution and Final Distribution, a photocopy of a one-page dissolution agreement bearing what looked like my own signature, and a check. The check was for $4,500. The memo line read in all capital letters, "Gratitude for your years of service." The dissolution document stated that I had agreed to withdraw from the partnership in exchange for a final settlement, surrendering all ownership rights forever. The signatures appeared to be mine and Mark's, both notarized, dated 6 days earlier. I stood in my living room, the grocery bag still dangling from my fingers, and I stared at that signature for a long, long time. The loops were a near-perfect match to my own handwriting, but the slant was just slightly off, maybe 2 degrees too far to the right. I know my own hand better than any forensic analyst ever could. That signature was not mine. I called Mark immediately. He didn't answer. I texted him, "We need to talk about this paper you sent me." He replied within 3 minutes, too fast, like he'd been waiting by his phone. "Let's do it in person, Mom. Kat and I will come by tomorrow. Don't worry about a thing, we're going to get you taken care of." Kat is his wife, a professional realtor who wears white blazers and speaks in a voice that always sounds like she's reading off a script for a luxury condo tour. They arrived the next morning, Kat carrying a glass Pyrex dish of baked ziti like she was delivering a casserole to a shut-in, and Mark hugging me too hard, too long, patting my back like I was a child who'd scraped a knee. Before I could get a word out, he started talking. He told me the buyer group required the dissolution to be signed quickly so they could close the deal, that he'd done me a huge favor by keeping the paperwork moving, and that the $4,500 was just an initial gesture. There'd be more later, he said, a phrase he never defined. Kat chimed in, talking about how this was really a fresh start for me, and they'd even discussed the idea of me moving into their pool house so I wouldn't be all alone in this big empty house. The pool house, like I was a golden retriever with arthritis who needed a soft bed near the filter pump. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse them. I just gave them a foggy, slow nod and said I was still trying to process it all. Mark kept glancing at Kat in that way couples do when they are running a script. She kept glancing at a manila folder she'd set on the kitchen counter. Inside that folder, I later learned, was a general release document that would have permanently barred me from any legal claim against the diner, the sale, or the proceeds. They wanted me to sign it that very afternoon. I said my head was pounding. I told them I needed to lie down. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and I walked straight into my closet, not sure what I was looking for. Maybe I wanted to hide. Maybe I wanted to find something to hold on to. I stood in that dim space breathing in the smell of old wool and cedar, and then I saw Jack's metal lockbox sitting on the top shelf exactly where I'd left it the day after the funeral. I hadn't touched it in 3 years. Something pulled at me to pull it down, pop the cheap latch and look inside. The box held the usual treasures, old photographs from our trip to the Georgia lot, Jack's high school championship ring, a pocket knife with a worn bone handle, and a laminated menu from the diner's opening night. I'd forgotten this menu even existed. It was yellowed now, the lamination peeling at the corners like old skin. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the stiffness of the plastic, and that's when I noticed a slight bump underneath the surface, a hidden layer. I sat down on the closet floor, right there among my shoes, and I carefully peeled the lamination away from the cardboard backing. A piece of folded paper was tucked inside, thin and crisp. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was our original 50-50 partnership agreement. The very first one, signed and notarized at the credit union, complete with the raised seal and the notary's full journal entry stamped on the back. I had assumed the only copy was in Mark's office safe, but then I remembered. On the day we signed, Jack had still been alive and he'd driven us to the bank. He must have slipped a copy into his keepsake box at some point, maybe that very night without telling a soul. I flipped to the final page, and there in Jack's handwriting, faded but unmistakable, was a note written vertically along the margin. It read, "If my son ever betrays you, this contract is the only truth you'll need. Do not trust anyone, save yourself." I sat on that floor for maybe 10 minutes, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. My husband, a quiet architect who'd spent his life measuring things twice and cutting once, had seen the flaw in his own son's character before he died. He had planted a legal seed for me, not knowing exactly what form the betrayal would take, but knowing it might come. When I came out of the bedroom, Mark was standing in the hallway fidgeting with his phone. He saw the old menu in my hand and glanced at it with total dismissal. "Mom, that's just an old menu. Throw that junk out. We've got real papers you need to sign so we can all move forward. I forced a tired smile and set the menu with the contract still hidden inside it on my nightstand face down. I told him I was too dizzy to read anything legal right then. I said I'd look at the release in a day or two. Kat's smile tightened like a spring. They left the baked ziti and the manila folder. I never touched either one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always leaves a paper trail. Now I'll take you inside the house of cards. The next morning, Mark and Kat showed up with a U-Haul attached to their Range Rover. They said they'd cleared out the pool house, swept it clean, put fresh sheets on the pull-out couch, and insisted I come stay with them while I recovered from the surprise. I knew what it was immediately. It was control. If I was inside their walls, they could monitor my phone calls, intercept my mail, watch for any sign that I was consulting a lawyer, and soften my resistance with home-cooked meals and soft lighting until I signed everything they put in front of me. I packed a single bag, and inside the waistband of my jeans, pressed flat against my stomach beneath my sweater, I folded the original partnership agreement. I walked slowly to their car. I let my eyes go glassy. I nodded at every sentence they spoke. I thanked them for their generosity 3 separate times. Inside, I was a vault with a hairpin trigger. Their house was a 5-bedroom colonial in a subdivision where every lawn looked like it had been cut with nail scissors. The pool house sat behind the main house, a small structure with a pull-out couch, a mini-fridge, a view of the filter pump, and a single window that looked out onto the deep end of the swimming pool. The first night, I laid awake cataloguing every sound. The hum of the central air, the occasional drip from the pool filter, and the muffled argument I could hear drifting from the main kitchen around 11 o'clock. Kat was hissing something about a title commitment and a missing document. Mark kept saying, "It's done, she signed it, it's recorded with the state." I had not signed it. That fact sent my first real spike of adrenaline burning into my bloodstream. They were not just lying to me, they were lying to themselves, and they were starting to crack. Over the next 4 days, I played the part of a woman who couldn't remember where she'd put her reading glasses. I shuffled into breakfast, mumbling small requests like I was recovering from a minor stroke. When Mark asked if I felt ready to sign the release, I'd place a hand on my forehead and whisper, "I just need a little more time, honey. My head's not right. Things feel foggy." He'd pat my shoulder and tell me to take all the time I needed, but his eyes would flick to Kat. She'd push a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice toward me with a smile that never reached her eyes. I'd noticed she never drank any herself. One afternoon, she casually mentioned that maybe we should talk about adding her name to my checking account so she could help me pay bills while I rested. I smiled and said I'd think about it. Another red flag. I began observing like a cat watching a mouse hole. The red flags stacked up fast and thick. Every morning around 10, Kat would take a phone call in her upstairs office. My pool house was connected to the main house by a heating vent that carried sound remarkably well, and if I stood on the couch and pressed my ear to the grate, I could hear her voice pitching into a frantic, high-pitched rhythm. Phrases like escrow is holding, and the buyer's title attorney is demanding original partnership minutes, drifted down to me like smoke. I heard her say, "No, Clifford, we do not have minutes because there was only one meeting, it was a dissolution, it was stamped by the notary." A long pause, then, "We cannot delay closing again. They will walk and we will lose this entire deal." Clifford. I wrote the name on a candy wrapper and tucked it into my pocket. That night I watched Mark pace the back patio with his phone pressed to his ear, his face turning a deep shade of red, before he hung up and threw the phone clean across the lawn into a lounge chair. The buyer was getting skittish. The escrow was hitting snags, and underneath it all I could feel the pressure building like steam in a boiler. On the third afternoon, Kat dropped a tray of glasses in the kitchen. The garbage disposal had jammed earlier, and when she flicked the wall switch, the sink backed up with grey water and a noise like a cement mixer chewing gravel. She shrieked. Mark came running from the living room, saw the sink, and just stood there with his hands in his pockets. Neither of them had any idea what to do. They stared at the disaster like it was a foreign language. I walked over slowly, my slippers scuffing the tile, and I reached under the sink and flipped the circuit breaker to kill the disposal instantly. I then pulled a 1/4-inch hex wrench from my jacket pocket. Yes, I keep a hex wrench in my jacket. I'm a line cook. We carry tools the way accountants carry calculators. I inserted the wrench into the bottom of the disposal unit, rocked it back and forth until the flywheel broke free from whatever was jamming it, and then I used a pair of tongs to fish out a chicken bone and a large shard of broken stemware from the grinding chamber. Total time, maybe 90 seconds. I wiped my hands on a towel, reset the breaker, and ran the water. The disposal hummed back to life. Kat stared at me like I'd just performed open-heart surgery. Mark said, "Since when do you know how to do that?" I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "The grill taught me more than how to flip a pancake." That was the first real crack in their image of me as a helpless old woman. I saw the flicker of unease pass between them, but they were too deep in their own scheme to change course. That evening, they left me alone for 2 hours to attend what they called a closing prep meeting at their attorney's office. I had the entire house to myself. I went straight to Mark's home office on the second floor. The door had a cheap interior knob lock, the kind you can buy at any hardware store for $9. I fished a paper clip from the kitchen junk drawer, straightened it out, and bent a tiny hook at the end. I'd learned to pick simple locks back in my 20s when our apartment super would get drunk and lock us out of the boiler room. It's just a tension wrench and a pick, and this lock gave up in under 40 seconds. Inside, the office smelled like printer toner and stale desperation. A shredder bin in the corner was overflowing with thin confetti strips. I knelt down and started pulling strips out one by one, glossy paper, bank letterhead. I laid the pieces on the carpet and began matching edges like a jigsaw puzzle. One strip read, "Certificate of Dissolution filed with the Secretary of State." Another read, "Signatory verification fails to match known exemplars." And a third, critical one, bore a partial routing number, the words Cayman Islands, and an account number on what was clearly a wire transfer instruction sheet. Mark was not just selling the diner. He had structured the sale so that a portion of the proceeds would be funneled into an offshore account using a shell company registered under my forged signature. He was setting me up as the financial patsy. If the IRS ever came knocking, I would be the one owning an undeclared foreign account, facing tax evasion charges. I kept digging. The filing cabinet in the corner was unlocked, but a smaller fireproof lockbox sat inside the bottom drawer. This one had a 3-wheel combination dial, and I didn't have time to crack it, but I didn't need to. I pulled out the manila folders from the top drawer and found a stack of photocopies of the dissolution document he'd mailed me. Clipped to the top was a yellow sticky note in Kat's handwriting. "Notary says she never saw Irene sign. She only notarized Mark's signature. This is a problem." So the notary on the dissolution had only witnessed Mark's signature, not mine. The document was legally invalid from the moment it was stamped, because a notary cannot certify a signature they did not witness in person. My stomach turned. I photographed every single page with my phone, including the sticky note, from multiple angles. I then found the original buyout agreement between Mark and the restaurant group, tucked inside a file labeled Closing Docs. The purchase price was printed clearly, $1,400,000. Below that, a separate addendum named a consulting fee of $200,000 payable to a company called Catbird Holdings LLC, whose registered agent, I would later confirm, was Kat herself. They were skimming $200,000 off the top of my half of the business before even splitting the remainder. I photographed that entire agreement. I backed all the images up to a cloud account I'd created under a fake name using a free email service, and then I deleted the local copies from my phone. I carefully replaced every folder and file exactly where I'd found them, smoothed out the carpet, relocked the office door with the paper clip in reverse, and was back in the pool house folding towels when I heard their car pull into the driveway. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I needed an ally. The original partnership agreement gave me the legal standing, but I needed someone on the inside of the transaction who would believe me and could freeze the process before the money vanished forever. I googled the title company handling the escrow on my burner phone, a cheap prepaid thing I'd bought with cash at a gas station. Their website listed a compliance officer named Marlene Hester, with a direct phone number and a professional headshot of a woman who looked like she didn't suffer fools. Compliance officers are the people who get paid to worry about lawsuits. They are paranoid by profession. I called her the next morning at 9 sharp, identified myself, and laid out the situation in a calm, factual voice. "Ms. Hester, I'm the 50% owner of the Gridiron Diner, and I believe a fraudulent dissolution has been filed in this escrow. The signature on the dissolution is a forgery. I have the original partnership agreement notarized, with a handwritten note from my late husband warning me this would happen. I also have evidence that a portion of the sale proceeds are being routed to an offshore account using my forged identity. I never signed anything. I never met the notary on the dissolution. I'm willing to provide documentation, but I need your help to stop this closing before the funds move." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Marlene said, "I've been uneasy about this file for a week. There's a title defect they keep trying to paper over. Send me what you have and I'll review it immediately." I drove to a FedEx office that afternoon, my folder tucked into a reusable grocery bag. I scanned the original partnership agreement along with Jack's handwritten note, and I also included the photographs of the shredded bank documents, the notary sticky note, and the buyout addendum showing the kickback to Kat. I faxed and emailed everything to Marlene using the store's secure service. Within 2 hours she called me back. I've placed an administrative hold on the escrow. The buyer's title attorney is now aware there's a cloud on title, and they will not release a single dollar until this is resolved. I've also contacted the notary from the dissolution. Her name is Linda Calloway. She sounded terrified. She confirmed to me that she was told you'd already signed in front of another notary, and she just needed to notarize Mark's signature to complete the page. She's willing to sign an affidavit. That was the crack in the dam. I drove straight from FedEx to the notary's office, a small storefront in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax prep shop. The woman, Linda, was in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and hands that shook as she poured me a glass of water. She told me in a whisper that Mark had come into her office alone, presented the dissolution with my signature already on it, and said I was waiting in the car and couldn't come in because I was feeling unwell. She'd been uneasy, but he'd been so smooth, so confident, and she'd stamped it. When Marlene called her, she realized what she'd been part of. She gave me a signed, notarized affidavit stating that she never witnessed my signature and that Mark had falsely represented the circumstances. I hugged her and told her she'd done the right thing. With that affidavit, I had a complete case: original contract, forged dissolution, notary affidavit, wire fraud evidence, and kickback scheme. Now I needed one final piece, something that would prove beyond any legal document that these people had absolutely no soul. I needed to see it with my own eyes. So I set a trap that was simple and devastating. The next afternoon, I planned everything carefully. Mark and Kat were both in the living room, scrolling through their phones, tense because the closing was supposed to happen in 2 days, and the buyer's attorney was now demanding a sit-down meeting with all partners present. I walked into the kitchen, waited until I was sure they could see me through the open floor plan, and then I grabbed the edge of the quartz countertop with both hands. I let my knees buckle softly and I dropped to the tile floor with a thud that echoed through the whole house. I landed hard on my left side, closed my eyes and kept my breathing shallow and irregular. I lay perfectly still. I heard Kat's voice first, flat and annoyed. What was that? Then her footsteps clicking across the tile. She came into the kitchen, saw me on the floor, and she did not scream. She did not call my name. She did not bend down to check my pulse or feel my forehead. She stepped right over my body, one high-heeled foot landing 6 inches from my ribcage, and walked directly to the kitchen table, where the release document still sat in its manila folder. She grabbed the folder and said in a voice completely devoid of any concern, "Mark, get in here. She's down. I told you she's been acting weird. We need her to sign this before anything else happens." Mark appeared in the doorway. He looked at me, looked at Kat, and then he did something I will never forget as long as I live. He did not check my pulse. He did not call for help. He reached down and took my right hand. Not my wrist, my hand. He lifted it, placed it on the table, and fumbled for a pen from the counter. He was trying to guide my fingers around that pen to scribble my signature on the release while he thought I was unconscious or dying. I felt the cold metal of the pen press into my palm, and I opened my eyes. I pulled my hand back sharply and said very quietly, "Get away from me." Mark stumbled backward as if he'd been hit. Kat froze with the folder clutched to her chest. I stood up on my own, brushed off my pants, and walked out of the house through the front door without another word. I got into my pickup, drove to a motel on the edge of town, and called my attorney. That image of a woman stepping over my body to grab a piece of paper that would steal my life's work, and of a boy I'd raised trying to force a pen into my limp hand, it extinguished every last scrap of maternal feeling I had ever held for him. It was gone, incinerated in an instant. Now the confrontation. The buyer's attorney, spooked by the title hold and Marlene's report, demanded a face-to-face meeting at the title company to resolve what they called the ownership dispute before they'd release a single dollar. Mark and Kat had no choice but to attend. They assumed I was still compliant, foggy Irene who couldn't find her keys. They picked me up at the motel in their Range Rover, both of them chattering nervously about how this was just a formality, that once I told the buyers I had no problem with the dissolution, everything would clear and we could all go celebrate. I nodded and stared out the window, my purse pressed against my stomach containing a folder that held everything: the original partnership agreement, Jack's note, the notary affidavit, enlarged photographs of the shredded Cayman documents, and a 1-page letter from my attorney summarizing the applicable criminal fraud statutes. We walked into the title company conference room exactly at 2 o'clock. It was a large room with a long walnut table that gleamed under soft lighting. On one side sat Ron, the buyer, a man in his 50s with a golf tan and a cautious expression, his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in a grey suit, and Marlene Hester, the compliance officer, who gave me a tiny, almost invisible nod. On the other side sat Mark, Kat, and their attorney, a nervous man who kept wiping his upper lip with a handkerchief. I chose the seat at the head of the table, which Mark probably thought was a humble gesture but which actually put me in the power seat, looking down the length of the table at everyone. Mark started to speak first, his voice full of practiced warmth. He said something about how we were all family here and there'd been a misunderstanding about the paperwork, that the dissolution was valid and just needed a little clarification, and that once Irene confirmed her signature, the closing could proceed. I let him talk for maybe 90 seconds. Then I opened my folder and began laying out the documents one by one, placing them in a neat row across the polished wood. I started with the original partnership agreement. "This," I said, "is the 50-50 agreement I signed with Market Credit Union in front of a notary public whose seal and journal log are on file with the state. It states in Section 9 that no dissolution or ownership transfer can occur without both signatures notarized by the same notary or by two notaries, each witnessing the signature in person." I laid down the forged dissolution next. "This is the document Mark filed with the Secretary of State. Please notice that my supposed signature on this page was not witnessed by the notary whose stamp appears at the bottom. That notary, Linda Calloway, has provided a sworn affidavit. I placed the affidavit down gently. She states under penalty of perjury that she never saw me sign, that Mark told her I had already signed elsewhere, and that she now considers the notarization to be fraudulent. This act alone is a Class C felony in our state." Kat's face drained to the color of a poached egg. Mark started to sputter. "That is a lie, she is confused, she's an old woman," but I kept going without raising my voice. I laid down the photographs of the reconstructed shredded bank documents. These fragments, which I recovered from Mark's personal shredder, show a wire transfer instruction to a Cayman Islands account tied to a shell company named Catbird Holdings LLC. This shell company was registered with the state using my forged signature as the principal. "You are not just stealing the diner. You are framing me for international tax fraud and money laundering." Ron, the buyer, leaned back in his chair, his mouth slightly open. His attorney slid her reading glasses on and began examining the notary affidavit with an expression that shifted from skepticism to cold fury. Mark's attorney tried to interject, saying these were unauthenticated photocopies and that this meeting was not a deposition. I ignored him completely and placed Jack's note on the table last, a simple piece of yellowed paper with his handwriting clearly visible. "Before my husband died," I said, "he knew his son. He left me a warning and the one document that would protect me. I have never given consent to dissolve this partnership. I have never signed a release, and I'm not going to sign anything today. The escrow will not close. The sale is void." Marlene Hester spoke then, her voice level and final. "Based on the compliance hold and the evidence provided, this title company will not disburse any funds. The closing is cancelled effective immediately, and we will be filing a report with the state's Real Estate Commission and, if required, the district attorney's office." Ron stood up. He shook my hand firmly, said, "Ma'am, I am so sorry for what you've been through," and walked out with his attorney without another glance at Mark. Mark started screaming. He screamed that I was ruining his life, that the diner should have been his all along, that I was never his real mother and he'd always resented me for marrying his father. Kat tried to gather the documents from the table, but I swept them back into my folder before she could touch a single one. I looked Mark straight in the eyes and said, "You never owned a single tile of that griddle, Mark. And you never will." At that moment, 2 police officers who had been waiting in the lobby, summoned by Marlene at my attorney's request, entered the conference room. They arrested Mark on 3 felony counts: forgery, filing a false instrument with the state, and attempted grand larceny. Kat was charged with conspiracy and acting as an accessory. She tried to claim she knew nothing, but the sticky note in her handwriting about the notary made that claim dissolve on the spot. They were both led out in handcuffs. The Range Rover stayed in the parking lot for 2 weeks before the bank repossessed it. Now for the aftermath. The sale was officially voided, and because of the partnership clause in the original contract that stated any attempt to fraudulently dissolve the business would result in full ownership reverting to the non-breaching partner, I became the sole owner of the Gridiron Diner. The restaurant group, embarrassed by the fraud and the publicity, declined to make another offer, and I was honestly relieved. I didn't want to sell. I wanted to burn the betrayal out of every tile and every booth until the place was clean again. Mark's criminal case dragged on for 11 months. The state appointed a forensic accountant who traced over $300,000 in misappropriated funds he'd skimmed from the diner's operating account over 3 years, using false vendor invoices and padded payroll entries. He'd been cooking the books since the first day we opened. He was convicted of 2 felonies and sentenced to 4 years, with part of the time served in a state facility and part on work release. Kat got 18 months of supervised probation and a permanent felony on her record that cost her real estate license forever. The restitution order forced them to liquidate that 5-bedroom colonial, both cars, a brokerage account, and a vacation timeshare. I received a check for $212,000, the full amount of the stolen operating funds plus my share of the liquidated assets. It wasn't a windfall, it was simply what had always been mine. But the ending I am proudest of is this. As part of his work release conditions, Mark needed to hold stable, verified employment. I offered him a job, 50 hours a week, scrubbing my flat-top grill at the diner from 5 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. He cleans the grease traps, mops the walk-in, scrapes the char off the broiler, and does every filthy, grimy task the health inspector can dream up. I printed him a uniform shirt in bright yellow, and on the back in large block letters it says "Flipped on Family." The front left pocket has the diner's new name, Griddle of Guilt. I renamed the diner the week after the trial ended. The menu now features an item called the Forger's Omelette, a 3-egg omelette with mushrooms and white cheddar served with a side of Justice grits, and every single receipt, the moment it prints from the POS system, includes his felony case number right beneath the tax ID number, so every customer who eats here knows exactly what happened. He can never escape it. He folds napkins with his own shame staring back at him from 20 feet of polished chrome. I still work the grill some mornings, sliding a spatula under eggs as the sun comes up. I feel Jack's presence in the sizzle of butter hitting hot steel. He knew, he always knew. The last page of that original contract sits in a small frame above the register, and I read it every time a new customer asks about the name. My husband left me a lifeline, and I grabbed it with both hands. The truth doesn't need a lawyer, not always. Sometimes it just needs a woman with a hex wrench in her pocket, a menu full of secrets, and a memory as sharp as a knife steel. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. And if you think that the best revenge is served on a flat top with a side of public humiliation, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story. Until next time, keep your contracts close and your enemies closer. I'll see you on the next one.